Hi, everybody. It's John Kranz of Compass Games. I want to welcome you to our 34th episode of Compass Games Live. Today is Thursday, June 18th, 2020. And of course, we're going to have our featured guest tonight, Joseph Balkoski, noted book author and historian, game designer, etc. So before we get started, just want to cover a few things real quickly. First, as far as our schedule goes, I updated it earlier this week. You'll find it on the website. So I'll go ahead actually right now and I'll show you just really quickly what we have happening. So let me just switch over. And here we go. So this should come up momentarily. So again, we have our schedule posted on our website, as you'll always find. So on the left column, you'll see our upcoming titles. Just FYI, we just shifted our schedule out by 1 month. So we'll have releases starting in July. We have 2 releases, Brotherhood and Unity and Paper Wars, featuring Hannibal by Stefan Newberg. And then we have 3 releases scheduled for August. Also, I want to point out a few more things, a few changes to the website. In the left extreme column, you'll see where we have our newsletter sign up form. I definitely would recommend if you could subscribe to our newsletter. All we need is your email address and we're good to go. If you do that, we'll be able to send you, for example, a recent newsletter. We try to send only once a week, so we don't want to barrage your inbox. So we'll average maybe once a week, or we had a special occasion today with a Kickstarter that's ending shortly, which I'll talk about in a moment. We did a second email for the week, but typically we're going to stick to 1 email per week. But as you can see, we'll talk about, whatever's a new release or recent releases, as I've done in this case here, the 3 most recent releases that came through: Decision of Kasserine, Russia Besieged Players Guide, Stellar Horizons. Obviously announcing our broadcast that we are now live with Joseph Balkoski. Also following this broadcast, there's going to be another broadcast. We have a double header tonight, Thursday night double feature show, because over on War and Pieces on YouTube channel, they're going to be interviewing game designer Andrew Rader again for Stellar Horizons. So that's going to be a featured interview as well. So again, if you can just take a moment and fill out the form on that left column for the newsletter, it would be great to make sure we have you on the list. You'll only hear from us maybe once a week, twice at the most, and we can give you the latest news, including specials, etc. So really appreciate if you're able to sign up. You might also notice in the bottom right corner, there's you can reach out to us if you have any questions, or actually if you have any feedback for us. It's feedback that we will use for our bi-weekly town hall meeting. So I've received about 20 or 30 responses already just in the past week alone. Some of those questions or some of that feedback we're going to be covering with Bill Thomas in our next town hall meeting, which will be a week from today, Thursday the 25th. And that'll be our second town hall meeting. So again, we really appreciate the feedback. Just click on my little video there where that says talk to me, and you can send me a text or a video message, and I'll be sure to respond to you directly, individually, but then we might also use your content for the broadcast. And I want to give a shout out to Craig Klosterman, who's the first customer who actually used a video response that we offer. So as you can see, we have a lot of text replies, which you can see in that middle column there. But kudos to Craig for not being camera shy. I would play it, but it's actually a general customer service question. So we'll forego playing the video, but it was great to put a picture and video to a customer name. It's great to be able to connect that way. And lastly, we did send out a newsletter just about an hour or 2 ago. So our Jacobite Rising, Command and Colors Tricorn, the new standalone module, it's going to be ending in about 44 hours, so less than 2 days. We've had a great response. It's great to have over 200 pledgers. And again, this doesn't include everybody that may have pre-ordered the game online directly through Compass. So if you've ordered the game already through us on pre-order, you're all set. This is just another marketing vehicle. It's another way to get the word out about a game, which really is more of a crossover type game, which would fit more for those into Euro games, etc., not just the standard hex-based war games. So we'll take those mounted map games with the deluxe components that aren't strict war games, and we like to put them on Kickstarter just to help spread the word. And I want to thank you for your support if you pledged. I mean, we had a great, this is, I think, probably our best Kickstarter, although Stellar Horizons was also a really big success for us as well. So that's, again, just really quickly a little bit about everything we have going on, and really we'll save more of the internal company news for next week. for our next town hall meeting. So without further ado, we want to get to our really our feature for today. And what I'd like to do is just do a quick introduction of sorts before I bring in Joseph. So it's my one chance to embarrass him. So again, for those, many of you on the broadcast tonight, you'll be very familiar with Joseph Balkoski. I think the question more is, when did you first become familiar with Joseph Balkoski? How old were you? How long ago? Which game was it? Maybe it was even his books, as you can see here. Roger McGowan posted a really nice a mix covering his Fire and Movement interview, which was back in issue 13, where Joseph shared he was born in New York in 1954, graduated from Vassar College, had a stint over in Columbia. So great background information about Joseph. As you can see, we've got some book titles here, focusing on 29th Infantry Division as well. What I also like to point out is he has many more books. So as you can see here, I've just got an expanded view. So this is my understanding that this is pretty much the breadth of Joseph's work. He'll correct me if I'm wrong, if there's any books missing. But we start back in 1989 with Beyond the Beachhead. He's focused really, as you can see here, on D-Day, Utah Beach, 29th Infantry Division. We're going to ask him a little bit about that today. But again, many of you might be also familiar with Joseph Balkoski's work with SPI. So I've got just a few titles here. Joseph actually took the Clausewitz Hall of Fame Award for the Charles S. Roberts Awards in 1989. So Hall of Famer in 1989 for the CSR Awards. And then at the very bottom, also he has some titles. I just pulled these off Board Game Geek. A lot of these titles will be familiar to you. And a lot of these are game series. It's not just one standalone title. It's the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War. Huge success. Obviously, you see Korean War in there, which we're going to be talking about later today as well. So really just, we're really excited to have Joseph Balkoski joining us tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and let's introduce Joe. Joe, I hope you can hear me okay. And thanks for joining us.
I can hear you fine, John. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you pretty good. So I think we're all set. So again, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it. When's the last time you did a broadcast interview on video? I think you just did some for D-Day. So you've probably been on video a lot lately, but maybe you can fill me in.
I've done a lot of live streaming in the past 10 days because of the D-Day anniversary. We did a whole live streaming from Normandy on D-Day itself, so that was a lot of fun. I'm getting used to this, so. But first time I've done it for gaming.
Well, it's great that. Great. Well, it's great to have you again. So what I want to do is we're going to open it up for what I like to do is really open it up for audience questions. So again, anybody who's joined us on Facebook Live or YouTube Live, please post your questions. I'll go through them. I'll be sure to ask your questions of Joseph. There will be a slight delay. Also, I'm noticing we do have a lag as far as just so you know, Joe, on your end, there's about a 3 or 4 second lag with your audio. Might resolve itself later. That's the nature of the beast. It worked fine earlier when we did our quick rehearsal to test everything, and everything tested with a green light, but we have a little bit of a lag today. We'll get through it fine, so I'm not worried about that at all. So let me just go through. I'm going to go through just a few questions. That will give everybody else a chance to get some of their questions logged as well, and we'll definitely turn it over to the audience. So I'm going to start with a basic slow curveball that you can hit out of the home park, as you've been asked this a million times. So I want to find out your introduction to the hobby. How did it start for you as far as wargaming as a hobby? Was it your childhood? How old were you? Where were you living? In New York, it sounds like. Give us your little story.
I lived in Queens, New York, and it all began as a very young kid because I was 6 years old when the centennial of the American Civil War started. And that really got me hooked. Plus, I had an older brother who had bought Tactics 2 from Avalon Hill, and even though I was only 6 or 7 and didn't really understand it very well, it was extremely intriguing to me. Got hooked on Avalon Hill games, and probably by the time I was 10, my mom was getting them for me for Christmas and my birthday. All of the standards: D-Day, Battle of the Bulge, Midway, and it became kind of an annual event. The Avalon Hill new release, and I was an utterly devoted Avalon Hill fan, and so it was both a family thing from my brother and also the Civil War centennial, which was really huge in those days. So that's how I got started.
All right, we're going to fast forward a little bit. So I'm really interested. I always like to ask this question for those that are alum of SPI. So I'm a big fan of SPI. I think I visited their office once when I was a teenager, but I was there for maybe 10 minutes, and unfortunately, that was the end of my experience. But could you share with everybody, how did you become involved as an associate with SPI? How did that whole SPI part of your history happen from the beginning?
Well, I discovered Strategy and Tactics magazine when I was in high school. I went to a hobby store, and there it was on a shelf with a game in the issue. I think the first issue I ever brought home was called Grunt. It was on the Vietnam War, and it got me hooked on that. It became evident to me that it was an alternative to Avalon Hill, and consequently, it piqued my interest. As a freshman in college, I was a classmate of David Isby, who I knew from a little bit from miniatures gaming in the early 70s, and he was working at SPI. So that was my real entree into the company. Within 2 months of my graduation from college, on a whim, I was getting a master's degree at New York University, which is just about a mile away from the SPI offices. And on a whim, I walked in the office and asked for a job, and a wonderful man named Howard Barish said we could use you, and the rest is history. It was a total turn of fate, because I just went in and didn't apply. I just went to the desk and said, "Can I work here?" And he said yes.
That sounds similar to other stories I've heard where people, I don't know if formal or informal is the right word, but it seemed like it was just sort of a natural progression. It just sort of happened very fluidly, where people were able to start it. I think Mark Herman started as a receptionist, and just people would come in and somehow they would just become involved somehow. So that seems familiar to other stories I've heard. So when we got to the design work at SPI, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of that work, I want to cut to the chase, and I really want to know from you, over your whole body of work at SPI, what was your most challenging or / rewarding bit of work? Pick either: rewarding, challenging, frustrating. You pick whatever that emotion is that stood out to you. We're really curious to learn more about what your experience was like for certain projects while you were there.
I would say both rewarding and challenging. By far, the most was the Operation Typhoon project, because I was the developer on that game. I was not the designer, and many of your listeners probably know the history of that game. It was designed as kind of a Bach am Rhein battalion level, very relatively complex simulation of the German attack on Moscow in November of '41. And when it was handed in, it was very evident to me that it was not going to go over well. It was unplayable, stacks of units, 8, 10 high, very, very dense placement on the map. And it was a watershed for me at SPI, because I had been there only 3 years, and it was kind of, I didn't really know whether I had the seniority to say, let me run with this game. And much to the credit of the staff there, I guess particularly Jim Dunnigan, he said, "Do what you have to do to make the game work." And I basically had carte blanche, and I completely redesigned the game. And I'm glad I did, because it stood the test of time. It spawned about 8 or 10 other new games. I worked on that game with the fundamental goal of trying to make it the first truly playable monster game, and I think it succeeded. And it just was a very tight moment for me, because in other circumstances I might have been fired for taking that initiative. But and believe me, people were fired a lot at SPI.
Oh yeah.
It was quite common, and rather than being fired, it almost really launched my career. And from that moment on, I had a level of independence that was very, very welcome to me. And that was almost, as I said, a watershed moment for my game design career.
That's an amazing story to me, and I'll tell you why, for several reasons. One, and many people know this who know me from the forum, Constant World, etc., because I always mention this. Operation Typhoon's my favorite game from SPI. I always mention it's my #1 game when people ask what's your favorite game, and that's across the board for any publisher. So when you mention, you sort of nailed it on the head, and it's exactly where I'm coming from. Why is it my favorite game? It's a sexy, beautiful, easy playable monster game. 3 maps, perfect size, great game system, and just a wonderful game. So to think that it started with something you were worried about and you had to completely change, it's pretty amazing that it ends up being my favorite game from where it started to where it ended up. At least for me personally, by far my favorite game from SPI. And what's really amazing is it's the only designer notes I know from SPI where the designer is openly bitching about how he hates the game. So,
Right,
so it's very humorous for me as a gamer saying, boy, this guy's complaining about the design. We know the backstory now, but it's changes that needed to happen. And he didn't see eye to eye with it. He had a different game in mind. But it's unique to me because from the standpoint of the designer notes really stand out if anybody looks at them. Just it's amazing how the designer sort of disagrees with what happened. And also was unique that you sent out a rules booklet. I believe I was an S&T subscriber, and I believe everybody who was an S&T subscriber maybe was just on your mail list at SPI. Lo and behold, one day I got a mailing from SPI, which was the Operation Typhoon rules booklet. Now, do you know how that happened? I'm just curious, how did this rules booklet by itself land at my home as a teenager?
that was Redmond Simonson's initiative. He felt that in this game we had something that could attract not only the hardcore but also the introductory gamer, and he just decided, I believe it was a Christmas thing in 1978. I may be wrong about that, but I do remember when he said, let's just send out the rule booklet, because the rule booklet is indicative of a game that is going to appeal to a lot of people, but clearly is going to be simple to play. And I think it was important because, we had this reputation of having complex rules. And Redmond always strove to try to make the games more approachable to everyone. So he was the genius behind that. People talk about that all the time. Hey, I was an S&T subscriber too, so I got my free copy as well. And you know what? I think I still have it because it came in a special jacket, I believe. And it was a great idea because it did not only help popularize that game, but it also, the golden years of SPI followed that release of that. 79 and 80, SPI was rolling really very well. And we had captured new audiences. We'd gone in the science fiction direction. Some of our games were selling 30,000 copies. So it was a golden era for sure. And of course, Redmond had a lot to do with that.
And then great question from Jack Stalika. He wanted to find out from you, do you have a fondest memory at SPI or Victory Games, as far as perhaps also who inspired you the most, as a follow-up question?
Well, SPI was an incredibly special place. We're coming on 45 years since I started working there, but honestly, there has never been a place of employment in my life that has come close to that place. It was so, clearly it's hard to name one thing, but the thing that stands out in my mind the most was the camaraderie of the people. We were bonded in a way that I have never, ever experienced again. It was almost like a military uniform type of bonding. The people not only worked smoothly together for the most part, but they also gathered socially together. For 6 years, pretty much, my life was SPI in all regards, in and out of the office.
Does anybody stand out for you? I don't know if it was Redmond or somebody else. I know you mentioned who introduced you at SPI, who you were close with, but is there anybody that stood out for you?
Howard Bowers was the one who hired me.
Yeah.
I would say, I would say Redmond, yes, although my relationship with Redmond, as I would think, was quite common with many SPI employees. It started out rocky. Mm-hmm. He was a true drill sergeant. He was a very, very tough man. And he had he was very intimidating for a person who was 21 years old, and I had just turned 21 when I took that job. But as the years went by, Redmond, it took, honestly, it took 2 to 3 years. But by 1978 or 79, Redmond was a genuine close friend.
Yeah.
And one of my most amazing memories of SPI is just by chance, when I was working at Avalon Hill, I was coming up to New York to visit my parents. And I went up to SPI and I walked in the office the day that it shut down. And the entire office was empty except for Redmond, maybe a couple of other people, and that the company had folded. And Redmond and I sat down in an office, an empty office, with paper strewn on the floor, and that to me is my number one memory of SPI. Even though ironically I wasn't even working there anymore because of the terrible sadness in Redmond's eyes. This effort that he had made over the space of 15 or more years was now gone, and he was close at that time with me. So that was a very tough moment.
That is rough. Yeah. That is very tough. Did you have a heads up of what was happening at SPI near the close?
A little bit. I mean, I worked at Avalon Hill, but of course I stayed in touch with people. No, I didn't really. The writing was on the wall at SPI for a long time. Okay. I had left the company in March of 1981 to go down to Avalon Hill, and another very poignant memory is Redmond called me into his office in that month. And he said, "What can we do to have you stay?" And I said, "Sorry, Redmond. I've made my commitment. Greener pastures." Yeah. There was something more stable about Avalon Hill. There was something attractive about how they didn't have the deadlines of SPI. But of course, my heart and soul was at SPI, and it was extremely difficult for me to tell Redmond that my decision had been made. Yeah. And I was leaving for Avalon Hill. And then within a year, the company was gone. So I was not directly aware, but hey, when I left the company, I knew that something was not right.
Well, thanks for sharing a bit about, your background with gaming, with SPI. It's really interesting, some of the stories, interesting about Operation Typhoon as well. Before we get into some more gaming discussions, particularly about sort of the feature focus for tonight, let's talk a little bit about your book writing. So what got you, how did that shift, if it was a shift, how did that shift happen for you getting into book writing? You've got several books now to your credit. How did that come about as you became an author?
I have SPI to credit that for. I mean, of course, when you worked at SPI, you were not only a game designer, but invariably you were asked to write articles as well. And I wrote a ton of articles at SPI. Always enjoyed that a lot. And I always felt, well, if games ever go down the tubes, I hope to have a career in writing. And I always kept that in the back of my mind. Always wanted to do a book on military history. And kind of the germ of that idea was born when I was doing the game Atlantic Wall. I think it was in '77. In order to do the research for that book, I read a very seminal book in my life called The Clay Pigeons of St. Lo. I remember vividly reading it on a subway as I was going to work every day. And that book ended up being the seed that grew into my body of printed work. It's about the 29th Division in Normandy. And by complete chance, when I started to work at Avalon Hill, which, as you know, is in Baltimore, and Baltimore is the home of the 29th Division and the division that landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. By chance, I met many veterans of the division near my home, and also many mentioned in that book, The Clay Pigeons of St. Lo. So that was the seed. And I right at the time when I was embarking on a freelance game design career, which we'll talk about in a second, I decided simultaneously to embark on a writing career. So while I was doing games, I was also writing my first book. And the first book took me about 5 years to do, Beyond the Beachhead. Came out in '89, and you know what? It's been in print continuously for 31 years. I got a royalty check for it the other day. So um, it that that the writing career was really born out of my game career, and I have the whole aura of SPI was to do things well, to research well, to make good games, to do it in a timely fashion. And when I was trained that way, that clearly impacted how I wrote books. I learned how to research when I did games, and that played over very well in the writing field as well.
One thing I noticed about your body of work, it does focus on D-Day Normandy, Utah Beach, 29th Infantry Division in particular. Could you tell us more about, you have a body of work around that division. How did that sort of come into play? And I have to say, I know some authors like to, especially with your rich history and background, you've got Civil War games in your background, a very extremely popular, successful, great campaigns of the Civil War. So some people would probably guess if you were an author and did 8 books, they'd say you probably did 2 on Civil War. You did 1, maybe Napoleon. You spread the wealth sort of, but you really have this nucleus and focus of your work. And I'm really curious what kept you in that pocket.
Well, the trigger was moving to Baltimore because the division that I ended up writing about is a local division raised in Maryland and Virginia just by chance. And it also by chance happened to be the division that led the way on Omaha Beach. And, it became very, very obvious to me that there were stories there that had not been told. So I befriended, I would say, it's not an exaggeration to say now in the space of 35 years, it's been thousands of 29th Division veterans. Obviously, almost none are living anymore. But I attended reunions going all the way back to 1984. It was kind of an alternate life for me outside of gaming, although deeply related to gaming. And I did games on the subject as well. But it was a perfect storm, John, because it ended up that I made a full-time career with the Army eventually. When games started to fade from my repertoire, I ended up having the very good fortune of having a job offer as a historian with the Army, and I ended up being attached to the 29th Division, and I had access to all of its voluminous records and artifacts. So I ran a museum, I ran an archives for years and years and years, and it just was the perfect storm because any detail that I needed to know about that division, from the finest to the broadest level, I had at my fingertips. In fact, I managed it. I managed all those records for 20 years. So I've been a very lucky man. I worked in a building where my dream job was. I had the wonderful experience of working in gaming, and then an equally wonderful experience of working with people in uniform.
That's great.
And that was a very similar bonding as I experienced at SPI. The people in uniform were very, very receptive to their history and very curious about the discoveries I kept making month after month about division history. So working with the people who actually lived this was a thrill for me.
I can tell that bond, you mentioned the bond at SPI that you haven't seen repeated at other workplaces, and now the bond with the 29th Infantry Division and all your work. I could see a recurring theme here that those relationships really mean a lot to you, which I totally get. I totally understand. Now, I want to return to gaming, but before I do so, I want to throw a little love your way, because nobody talks about this game, okay? Nobody talks about why. Nobody talks about Upscope. Okay, I've even got the shrink wrap on it still. That's because I've got other copies of it. So I have played it. So I just want you to know, I'm going to give you, the cursory nod that I think, and I think this is one of your first designs for SPI, one of the earlier designs you did. Is that right?
I first did a game called DMZ, which was part of a quad, and then Upscope was my second independent design. Yeah.
So I went nuts for this whole World War II thing. I think I remember when you have childhood memories, some things stick like it was yesterday just because they were special for whatever reason. And I don't know why this was special to me, but I can remember like yesterday, I was 15 or 16. I got up at 6 a.m. with an alarm clock and put the upscope rules down on the carpet on the floor and started highlighting. And it was just like yesterday.
I don't even own one, John. You're a better man than I am.
I'll have to send one your way. I've got like three or four. One of my favorite games. I know it has, I think it had some plotting in it, which is maybe a no-no today for solitaire. But if anybody knows of Upscope, I've played it. It's a very intense game, 2-player game. So thanks for doing Upscope. We're going to talk now, though, a little bit about a different game. So I actually have it here. Should ring a bell for people. So we have some comments also online about the Korean War. This is with Victory Games. Can you tell us how this game happened for you during your time at Victory Games? A little background on the Korean War.
Sure. Well, that game was a real watershed for me. That was the first game in my career that I designed as a freelance person for royalties rather than doing it as a full-time employee. After 8 or 9 years at SPI in Avalon Hill. So it was a new venture for me to get royalties. Kind of exciting, actually. It also was a watershed for me because it was my first project with Victory Games. The company was relatively new. It was all my friends from SPI, and I think everyone was very excited about making that company work. And I was thrilled to get that assignment. And third, it was a first for me because if you know that game, it was my first venture into the get away from the I go, you go method of wargaming. It was my first experimentation with varying impulses between players depending on initiative. And I wasn't entirely confident that it would work. But I was very happy with how it ultimately ended up working. And it's been the basis of almost every game I've ever done since, in terms of the never allowing either player to have their eyes off the table for fear of missing something significant. However, I will tell you that it was not my idea to do this game. This was my friend Mark Herman's idea. He ran Victory Games, and he said, "Hey, do a freelance game for us." And I said, "Sure." And he said, "How about doing a game on the Korean War?" I knew nothing about the Korean War. In fact, there were very few games on the Korean War. I think SBI had done one in the early 70s that I had played. But Mark really knew what would sell. And I wanted to do what would sell because as a freelancer, I wanted to have as many sales as possible. I trusted Mark implicitly, and even though I knew nothing about the subject, I jumped in. And one of the benefits about being a freelancer, unlike working at SPI, is I could take my time. Even though I could take my time, I do think I knocked the game out in 6 or 8 months, which by today's standards is fast, but by SPI standards is slow. And I was very, very happy with the game because it not only combined military aspect, but it also gave a very pronounced, diplomatic and political feel. So. I have Mark to thank for convincing me to do the game.
Oh, then we have to thank Mark as well. So as you can see here on screen, we have the new edition we're working on right now. So it's been, let me first say it's been a pleasure to work with you on the new edition. We're going to talk about some of the enhancements that have made or some of the changes that have been made. And you're the perfect person to explain to everybody. A lot of people are interested. I have one question already wanting to know, for example, right here, what are some of the changes to the second edition? We're going to get into that here in a moment. But I just want to let everybody know we have on the website, of course, we have the front cover. We have also the back cover already done. Again, the game's making really great strides. The maps are done. I'll show the map here in a moment. Counter sheets as well. So again, just really excited and looking forward to this release. So what I want to do really quickly here is I'm going to just show a little bit more about the game. So let me just pull up, and we'll actually bring up the map. I think that's a good thing to bring up. So this is a super-sized edition. We're using 9/16" counters, but it ends up being 4 maps, actually, because, again, just to accommodate the larger counter sizes. This should look familiar to people. I've shown this before. We're following the course, just so everybody knows. What we do is we're mimicking the original Victory Games edition with the charts and tables that are on the map. So there's no major changes there. But one change that you will definitely see is we're reproducing all the charts and tables you see on the map will also be on separate player aid cards. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is we don't want anybody, especially if you have failing eyesight like myself, that has trouble with your eyes, looking over 3 or 4 maps for a certain chart or table could become perhaps fairly painful, not so easy to do. So we'll have everything on player aid card format for everybody. So that will be available. The one exception will be we have some holding boxes, etc., that are on the map sheet already. We'll only reproduce those if, for example, for the shorter scenarios that uses lesser maps. I think right now the shorter scenarios, we're working out of the 4 maps. I think it's down to 3, but then maybe 1 or 2 of those 3 maps can be folded in half or a quarter and a quarter or a third. So we're working out to minimize the table space needed for the map space for the smaller scenarios. So based on whatever that map area is, if there's any missing holding boxes that aren't there for the smaller scenario, we're going to make sure there's player aid cards for any holding boxes you need for this for those shorter scenarios, for those smaller scenarios. So as you can see here, the map again, great artwork by Ilya over in Russia, who's doing the work for us. A lot of information on the map. If I zoom in here, let me just give people, now we aren't 1080i high def yet as far as the broadcast platform. That's going to be coming soon. But again, this will give you a little better idea, everybody online, as far as the richness of detail of the map. So just want to share that map for a moment. Again, really looking forward to it. The map will be trimmed, by the way. So if you look at the maps now, you'll see in the bottom right-hand quadrant, there's some dead space. The maps are going to be cut, so you're not going to have to worry about that space, on your tabletop. The maps will be trimmed, so that area, bottom right, will not be there. So the map, paper maps will get trimmed. Also, we have the counter sheets that I want to show quickly here as well, Joseph. So let me go ahead and pull up counter sheet. Here's number 1. I'll expand it up just a little bit. But again, this, I don't think there's been too many changes to the counters as far as the new edition goes. I know that the manifest changed a little bit. I think we may have added some additional game markers. Is that correct, Joseph? That we added a few markers, I believe.
Also, 1 or 2 order of battle corrections, thanks to some very devoted gamers who contacted me. Entrenchment markers now apply to the particular side rather than being generic, so we had to increase the number of them, but things like that,
Yeah. And then there's the third sheet's actually a half sheet, so I can zoom in here a little bit where we have some of those markers, and it's for each side, as you mentioned, that we have those now. So we did expand the game markers. We always look for that for the designer signature edition. We always look at where we can add additional markers for mnemonics, for housekeeping in general. Now, one thing that I think is a good point of conversation, especially for those that aren't familiar with the game, is you've got probably one of the most detailed game turn record sequence of plays, because it changes, I believe, game turn to game turn. So this is actually 2 pages, or a front and back, through game turn 12. Could you explain a little bit about what this is covering? And I believe you also made some change. There's also some changes reflected in this game turn record track for the advanced game based on some modifications that you made.
Well, this 2-page insert, which was in the original game, but I did modify it for the Compass edition, it's basically a literally step-by-step sequence of play for every single turn if you choose to follow it, because every turn changes based on things dropping out and new elements being added. But to answer your other question, yes, there were some significant changes. I might even say the game comes close to being a redesign. I don't think I'd go so far as to officially call it a redesign, because it does maintain the heart and soul of the original, but there are some significant changes. The first, and this was one of the most common comments from people who played the original, is that the so-called global tension system, which is deeply impacts the UN player, and in fact can lose the game for him directly if he reaches the so-called World War III level. Global tension in the original game was heavily influenced by die roll luck. So the UN player with abysmal die roll early in the game could have very little chance of winning the game. I corrected that in many, many different ways. I started the global tension die rolls later in the game. I reduced the impact in terms of victory points. And in essence, greatly lessened the possibility that bad luck could lose the UN player the game in itself. So that's the most major change.
Right, and then there's a question from Fabrizio also asking about the UN reinforcements and historical versus variable in the game. Is that something you could comment on as well for Fabrizio?
Well, that's a great question, because that was a fundamental element of the original game. The UN reinforcements is based entirely on the commitment level that the player declares for the UN player at every turn of the game. The more you commit, the more reinforcements you're going to get. The more US and Commonwealth and other allied forces you're going to receive. But the higher the commitment level, the higher the global tension level is, and the more you have a chance of losing victory points and or reaching the dreaded World War III. So at the suggestion of Bill Thomas of Compass, we're also going to include in this game, it's a great idea, the historical commitment levels, because they were not included in the original game. So
right, I was
players
going to say the historical. Yeah, that's something we didn't. That's something that Bill wanted, was to recreate the historical commitment levels, so you can almost play it out as it did historically, having all that information available. I think that's a real nice addition to the game that people will be seeing for the first time for Korean War.
Right. And there are other changes as well. I mean, there were gamey techniques of the UN player once they've crushed, or shall I say, counterattacked and drove the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel into the north. There were some gamey means by which the UN player could completely avoid the chance of Chinese intervention. And I changed that. So there is always a chance, a slight chance, if you don't invade the north, that the Chinese can intervene in the war. And the more you push into North Korea, the greater the chance that they can intervene. But there is a chance that they can intervene even if you don't push over the 38th parallel, which adds a very different element to the game.
Yeah, and then a question from Richard. I commented already about the map. So the smaller scenarios, it's I know it's one full map, and then there's two other maps which we might be able to, as I mentioned, fold partially. We're checking right now what the hex coordinates are. So there might be two maps where we can maybe just use a portion of those maps. So so to answer your question, Richard, I don't have the final answer yet, but right now it's one full map. There's two additional maps, and we're checking right now, Richard, if those two maps can be folded partially to save on table space. But we do know that we do need three maps, or a portion of three maps, for the smaller scenarios. I think I got that right, Joe, correct?
You did.
Okay, and then, well, like I said, we're going to look to shorten it where we can, as I mentioned. And then in terms of solitaire playability, Joe, why don't you go ahead and comment, take that one on for Richard, if you could, about, if you were playing with solitaire, how that would go.
Well, other than the fact that you mentioned Upscope, which was back in 1977, which was not playable solitaire.
Right.
It's very, very important in my game design career for games to be playable solitaire. It's extremely important because, in my life, 95% of my gaming has been solitaire. It's changed somewhat recently with Basel. But, when I designed the Civil War series, it was very important for me that it be able to be played by somebody who just wanted to study the campaigns and have some fun. So Korean War is very playable solitaire. I know because when Compass signed me on to have the game reissued. I set it up on my own table and probably played it solitaire, the entire campaign game, at least 5 times. So it's quite enjoyable to play solitaire, and there's nothing in it that makes it unfeasible in any way to play solitaire.
Wow, great. Thanks. Thanks for sharing that, Joe. So just to give everybody a quick update on the project. So where we are, the counter sheets are done. The maps are going through a final proofing. What we did with the maps, as you noticed before when I showed you the maps, there's a lot of charts and tables, holding boxes, etc. 20 plus elements on the map. All that got proofed. I know, Joe, you've gone through, you've proofed them several times. So we've made all the corrections necessary, all the changes to the charts and tables. Those are now getting updated on the map. And then we're now also taking them over to those separate player aid cards I mentioned. So you have 2 options or ways that you can consult the tables during play. Then what we're going to be getting into next is the entire unit displays, setup, reinforcement schedules, so on and so forth. That will be the last phase, and then we'll get into the rules booklet layout. You've already finished the rules draft, Joe, so you've got all the rules updated with the changes that you've talked a little bit about tonight. So just to let everybody know where we're at, again, we're in the final proofing phases. Still have to do a little bit on the still have to do the unit displays for the reinforcements and setup, so that's still coming up, and then we'll get to the rules, and that will be the final piece of the puzzle to go to print. So we're looking actually at an August 2020 release date, probably latter half of August is what I would expect with the printer turnaround time. So we're very eager to get the game out. So with that being said, I want to turn it over to our audience, both on Facebook and YouTube Live really quickly. So I'm just going to share some comments with you, Joe. So from Mark Ruggiero, Omaha Beachhead and Fleet Series, he's giving a tip of the hat to you. And I know there was another question asking right here, what game or game series are you most proud of? And don't worry, you don't have to say Korean War just because we've been talking about Korean War, which everybody can see, right?
Well, I'll be honest. I'm clearly most proud of my Civil War series because it's it not only kept me occupied for a couple of decades, but it also found some truly marvelous fellow gamers who have assumed significant roles in the design and development of those games. And the community of Great Campaigns of the American Civil War is truly one of the finest communities of gamers I've ever been in. And the gatherings of those players are highlight of the year for me. And I'm doing a new game on Hood's 1864 campaign in Tennessee, and it's just that's been my I think clearly my proudest achievement in the gaming hobby.
Yeah, I would say that's a good pick. It's an amazing game series, and it's a huge community around it. So yeah, congratulations on that. Question from Mark Merritt asking you, Joe, what about St. Lo? I know a little bit about that, but I'll let you answer that question. I know that's something that's coming down the pike from another publisher.
Well, St. Lo was also, I did that game simultaneously to the Korean War, but it was not with Victory Games. There was another company right down the street called West End Games that I'm sure many of you will remember. It also had a couple of ex-SPI people in it. And St. Lo was the first game I did for West End. It also was the exact subject matter of my first book, Beyond the Beachhead. So it was a perfect, research means of getting paid for some of my research and so forth. St. Lo was very similar to the Korean War in that it was the first time I ventured into the interactive means of players alternating phases and turns, and it struck a nerve like the Korean War, and the game is being reprinted. It's being reprinted by Quarter Deck, I believe, and it's probably within a couple of months of coming out. That one, however, I really didn't touch very much, and it's essentially
a reprint.
Aside from one, it's essentially a reprint.
Yeah, great. And then comments here about St. Lo as well, Walk them Rhine, Fleet Series, and then another question on Fleet Series. And I know I've been keeping you occupied with all the Korean War proofing of all the components and the charts, but I'm looking forward personally to working on Fifth Fleet for you as the first entry of the Fleet series as far as doing a new edition. But if you have anything you want to add to that, I know I've been keeping you occupied though from getting to the Fleet series with Korean War, but I know that's next on our docket.
Well, the Fleet series occupied as much of my life almost as the Civil War series.
Yeah.
I would say that series really took up a lot of my life for 10 or 12 years. And it was a wonderful learning curve. I didn't know much about the Navy when I first started that. I believe yet again that title was the first title. Sixth Fleet was recommended to me. I didn't choose it, but it ended up doing very. I think that game sold more copies than any game I have ever designed. That was in the days when Avalon Hill, but it was a Victory game. Which was a subsidiary of Avalon Hill. Avalon Hill could sell 30 or 40,000 copies of a game. And I think I luckily cashed in on that era when such sales were possible. The Fleet series was kind of a living series in that even though it had 5 games in it, plus 1 computer game, every game is kind of a standalone game with an independent rules set, because the rules change subtly, not only based on people's comments, but based on new things that I was learning, based on the theater that the game was portraying. But ultimately, the last game I did in the series, Third Fleet, it had to be the end because the Berlin Wall had come down and there was no more Soviet Navy, so there really wasn't that much more for me to do. And right from that moment, I jumped into the Civil War series.
Yeah, to John Hung's great. John Hung's asking a question. I don't know if this is true or not. Was Task Force a predecessor to the Fleet series? No. Okay, yeah, because he was asking. Okay, yeah. He's asking about the potential of. He thought Task Force had a lot of real potential to become a series, etc.
Task Force was an SPI game that was chosen by the infamous feedback system. It got a very high rating from the subscribers to Strategy and Tactics, but I did not write the feedback proposal. I just happened to be assigned the game. Yeah, that happens a lot.
I sense a problem. I sense an issue coming up.
Well, it was the last game I did for SPI. Actually, the game did not come out until I was already at Avalon Hill. But no, that was a fun game to do. However, you know what? That was like Upscope. That was an exception to my game design philosophy. That game could not be played solitaire, and I never was happy with that. I always had a regret about that, and I think the Fleet series, I understood 100% that I could not go that way, with the system that required secrecy between 2 players.
All right, well, let's wrap up. We're getting on the hour, so just a few quick questions at the end that if some people have asked, which I believe mainly are on the Fleet series. And first question is, will the Fleet series reissue a standard set of rules covering the multiple games? We haven't had that conversation yet, so I don't know if that's even possible or not, if they're too different to bother trying to have a standard system set of rules and then having exclusive rules for each game. I don't know if that's even, I don't know if that's in the realm of possibility because we haven't had that discussion yet since we haven't started Fifth Fleet yet.
I've given it some thought. It would be a monumentally difficult project to do that. I don't honestly know whether it would be feasible. I have to give it some thought.
Yeah. Great question. I don't know.
It would change the balance of every scenario in every game if you standardize the rules, and the scenarios would have to be retested. Standardizing the rules is a notable undertaking, but remember the series covers many, many different theaters, and it covers a very long time frame of time. And weapons changed.
Yeah.
So my thinking is. Probably not.
I'm saying probably so. No. Yeah, it's just I don't think the ROI is there, the return on investment for the effort to do that, because it sounds like it's going to conflict with the situations you're trying to portray. They really need their own unique approach. Mark Ruggiero is asking, please do Second Fleet. Actually, our goal is to do all the Fleet games, but we want to start with the Fifth Fleet as the first game. Let's see, consider a modern expansion of Fifth Fleet, so bringing it to present day. We haven't talked about that because we're really talking about just, taking, not just, but we want to take the games you've already done. And again, similar to Korean War, we want to be able to enhance them, but not take Korean War to the 21st century. So I know that we don't have plans right now to do that right now with Fleet series. We want to basically get those games out again, but with enhancements. After that, who knows? After the few years that we get all the Fleet games out, I don't, if there's a need for something like that. It's an interesting idea. I know we got Blue Water Navy and other games from Compass Games, Indian Ocean region. So we've got games in that area going that way. But I don't know your thoughts about what you've done with Fleet series, but then being superimposed on present day situation.
That would have to be a completely new design in my expectation, because first of all, so many ships in the original games are gone. So many new ones. Tons of new weapon systems, tons of revolutionary new weapon systems, lasers. Of course, the Chinese Navy is now significantly different than it was in Seventh Fleet. It's a very noble idea, and it's a wonderful prospect for a game. It's just that it's going to have to be a new game.
Yeah, which makes total sense. So we're going to end on one final comment. So I want to thank everybody for joining us on Facebook and YouTube. Final comment we have here, because again, you've got such a rich portfolio of games, Joe. We're going all over the place here. We've covered everything from Upscode. I know you did a sports game. I believe you did a sports game as well. One of your early
a couple of sports games.
Games, right? So we want to give some love to Lee versus Grant. So that game's not getting enough love. Like I said about Upscope, not enough love. So we have somebody else stepping in saying there's another game that hasn't got enough. Can you talk a little bit about Lee versus Grant for us, and we'll close on that.
Sure. Now, Lee versus Grant was a Victory Games game. It truly is the predecessor of the great campaigns of the Civil War. It follows a distant cousin type of sequence of play and progression of the units, and it sold very, very well. But I never was exactly happy with the scale. The scale was core level, and it didn't give enough of a sense of. It didn't even remotely give a tactical sense to the maneuvering of a Civil War army. And I really, right from the word go, I said I wish I had doubled the scale, and the map scale that has gone down to like a mile a hex as opposed to 2.5 miles a hex, and gone down to divisions for units. And that's essentially what the great campaigns of the Civil War is. And I think I was right in that regard, because if you look at the great campaigns, you really are, the map is at such a fine level that the road network really determines everything. In Lee versus Grant, you don't capture that. It was a very fun game, and I enjoyed it. Sold very well, but I knew right from the word go that I wanted to enhance it by doing what I eventually did.
Well, Joe, we could have gone on for several more hours. We could have talked about SPI and your beginnings for a few hours. We could have done book discussions, 29th, and talked about the 29th for a few hours, Omaha, Utah, the whole works. And I do want to ask one final question, and this is one I almost missed, and it's very important, I think, because similar to some other designers, another one that comes to mind is John Southard. You've done a huge body of work for game design, a lot of now books, great body of work with books, but it looks like now, I don't know if it's part of your retirement plan, but it looks like you're becoming more active with game designs again. And I just want to ask you that question. Is Joe Balkoski now going to be more active with game designs? Seems like you've got multiple titles in the works from multiple publishers. And how's that experience shaping up for you for being back in the whole game design world, if you truly took a break from it recently, that is?
I took a very extensive break from game design. I always kept my finger on the pulse of the Civil War games, but I didn't personally design any for a long period while I was working for the Army. But you did hit the nail on the head. I'd say for a year and a half now, since I retired from the Army, I have been actively back in gaming. I'm completing a game on Hood's invasion of Tennessee in 1864 for the Great Campaigns. That game is done. That should be out by the end of the year, I hope. Very fun game. I really enjoyed it. I'm thinking of maybe venturing out into other wars for the Great Campaign series, Napoleonic, Revolution.
Wow. Yeah.
You know, it has such a, as I said, a very devoted body of players and testers that, you know, it's you're not working alone anymore. And also, I'm indirectly involved. Somebody else is doing the main design on a re-release of Grant Takes Command and On to Richmond, which is going to be a major both 1862 and 1864 release, probably within about a year and a half or so. I'm play testing that now. Yeah, so I am back in the field, and you know what? I may even venture off and try a completely new design. I wouldn't be surprised.
And you're having fun with it? It's a nice return to design for you? Are you enjoying your time?
I am, because you know it is bringing back the memories of the camaraderie. The camaraderie of gaming was always very high, and it's just been, you know, I've been a lucky man, and that gaming is a reflection of my interest in military history, and to be involved as a professional in the field of military history, I wake up every morning and I still kind of can't believe that that's what I do.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I ever got rich. I never got rich doing this. But you know, I'm a lucky man in the sense that I've met thousands of World War II veterans who I call friends. I've written books. I've done games. I've met some amazing people. I've lived in Normandy for a long time, and all of this is related to my interest in military history. So I am indeed a very lucky man.
Well, congratulations to you, and we're all privileged to have enjoyed all your body of work. What Jack said, I think, sums it up best. I think, speaking for the entire community, that you've brought us decades of fun. The one comment Jack forgot is you owe us several more decades of fun. So since you're back in design, we're going to hold you to that, Joe. We're going to hold you to a few more decades of fun if we can. So again, I want to thank you also on behalf of Compass Games for working with us on the Korean War. And then we're looking forward, obviously, to the Fleet series, starting with Fifth Fleet after that. So again, Joe, thank you so much for your time tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna let you go. Enjoy the rest of your evening while I sort of put the wrap on the show. But thank you so much for everything you do and everything you've done for us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate it. It's been fun.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Okay.
So again, everybody, I want to thank Joe Balkoski. And as I mentioned, we focused on the Korean War, which will be out around August of this year. Quick reminder happening right now, because we went a little overtime. We've got War and Pieces live right now with Andrew Rader, the designer of Stellar Horizons. If you go over to YouTube, simply do a quick search, just type War and Pieces and Andrew Rader or Stellar Horizons, and you'll find that live interview taking place right now. Also want to mention Brief Border Wars was our most recent release that's gone out. Also, we have Brotherhood and Unity hiding behind my head right there. So that's going to be coming out. That's our next release. So I hope, again, I want to thank you all for joining. For those in a later time zone, I want to thank you for being up past midnight for you local time. Again, we'll have this edited recording available on our YouTube channel at Compass Games. We'll be joining you again next Thursday on June 25th for our second town hall meeting with Bill Thomas. So please get your questions in on our website. We'll be bringing in all your questions for Bill at that time. So we'll talk to you again in about 1 week. So thank you, everybody. Have a great night. And maybe I'll see you over at the War and Pieces live interview, which I'm going to switch over to myself right now. Good night, everybody.